We are just getting ready to speak with Mr. James Perloff today. Now, James Perloff is a freelance author. He's contributed to the New American Magazine since 1986, and his first book, The Shadows of Power, was an expose of private influence on American foreign policy, and it has sold over 100,000 copies. He's also been a guest on well over 100 radio and television programs to discuss both history and the creation-evolution debate, including such forums as WorldNet Daily and Today's Issues. He's joining us today to speak about his new book, which is called Truth is a Lonely Warrior, Unmasking the Forces Behind Global Destruction. We had him on as a guest to discuss the book a few weeks ago, but so much depth in this book, we wanted to bring him back and have a further discussion with him. And if you're one of these people who thinks that maybe we're not being told exactly what's going on by the media, the mainstream media, this is going to be a book you're going to want to check out. It is on sale right now at the Power Hour at the Power Mall for $17.75, and it is a very good synopsis of how history and current events are driving us towards a one-world government. James Perloff, I cannot thank you enough for joining us again today.
You should be coming from me to you guys for having me on this wonderful show again.
Oh, we had so many people writing and telling us that they enjoyed your conversation last time. It's a foregone conclusion that we'd like you to come back. Today we're going to have a discussion about your entry or your opener in the book, which actually I have to admit surprised me a little bit, and it was the history of 6 major influential wars in our country and some of the events that led up to them. And I think that you might be of the opinion that there is a common thread that you can weave through all of these events, and I am willing to bet that you think that there's probably a continuation of that thread occurring today. So let's just jump right into it. I want to go back 100 years, and let's tell some people the things that they don't know about the Spanish-American War.
Right. Well, we'll try to hit on 6 wars and 6 false flags in the Spanish-American War, of course, with the sinking of the Maine. And Americans went to war after this battleship was blown up in Havana Harbor in Cuba, with 266 American sailors dead. Cuba, of course, belonged to Spain at that time, and the battle cry was, "Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain." And we went to war with Spain and won that war very quickly. But why would I call that a false flag? Well, there's no evidence whatsoever that Spain was responsible for the sinking of the Maine. In fact, they're the last people on earth who would have wanted to sink the Maine. And the reason I say that is that they were bending over backwards to avoid war with America. We had an essentially steel navy. Their navy was more outmoded, mostly wooden ships. The commander of their Atlantic Squadron, Admiral Cervera, told their government, quote, "We lack everything necessary for a naval war, such as supplies, ammunition, coals, etc. We have nothing at all," unquote. And to fight America in Cuba, they knew that they'd have to travel 4,000 miles, whereas Cuba is just 100 miles off the U.S. coast. They did not want this war. They gave in to every demand we made except to leave Cuba. That we didn't like the governor, so they recalled the governor, and we said we want the people of Cuba to have autonomy, so they offered to give Cuba semi-autonomy like Britain gave Canada. Mm-hmm. They were trying not to have a war, and so they would not have done something provocative like sinking the Maine. And so when that happens, what you want to do is look who would have motive for sinking the Maine. Mm-hmm. And to give it some context, Cuba, by the 19th century, had become the richest colony in the world. It was the world's largest sugar producer. And the Rockefellers, who had gained monopoly on oil through Standard Oil, which they called black gold, now wanted a monopoly on Cuba's white gold, or sugar. Mm. The president at that time was William McKinley, Freemason. He had gone bankrupt while governor of Ohio, of course, being the headquarters of Standard Oil. He was bailed out by the Rockefellers through their front man, Mark Hanna, who'd been John D. Rockefeller's classmate in high school. Mark Hanna then became McKinley's political manager, and he was known to be the White House boss. So you know who's controlling things. No different than today. It's still the banksters back then. But if you want some proof as to did the Rockefellers get control of the Cuban sugar industry, they were running the National City Bank, and Ferdinand Lundberg, in his book called America's 60 Families, published long ago, he was a writer for the Wall Street Journal. That was the best analysis of the McKinley administration. He noted that the National City Bank was running McKinley. Well, here's what he wrote in his book. After the war, he said, quote, "The Cuban sugar industry gravitated into national cities' hands, unquote. William Guy Carr, in his book Pawns in the Game, wrote, quote, National City Bank owned and controlled Cuba's sugar industry when the war ended, unquote. Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in American history, wrote in his book War is a Racket, quote, I spent 34 years in service as a member of the Marines, and during that period, I spent most of my time being a muscle man for Wall Street and the bankers. I helped make Cuba a decent place for National City Bank to collect revenues, unquote. And I'll give you one more from Mark Twain. He said, quote, how our hearts burned with indignation against the atrocious Spaniards, but when the smoke was over and the dead buried, it suddenly dawned on us that the cause of the Spanish-American War was the cause of sugar, unquote. Several other quick points I should make about this war, but let me pause here.
Well, I think it's interesting, too, because you pointed out to me that nobody even realized that the Maine was en route to that harbor, and it showed up, and everybody, I guess, was expecting that surprise was going to lead to the immediate sinking of it, and that wasn't the effect, was it?
Right. Well, we're in a tinderbox situation with Spain. They sent this battleship right into their harbor. The Spanish had not been notified that the battleship was coming. In fact, we didn't even notify the Consul General of the United States in Havana. Nobody knew that ship was coming in. But when no shooting erupted and the Spanish allowed it to dock, another method of setting off the war had to be found.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think actually happened to the Maine then? I mean, in terms of...
Jay, I have to say that there have been 6 official investigations into the sinking of the Maine, both by Spain and U.S. Naval Courts of Inquiry and the National Geographic and the Discovery Channel did scientific studies, and half say that it was sunk by an outside device and half by an internal event, and there is no agreement about that. I don't know, and I think nobody knows except the perpetrators themselves as to how the Maine was actually detonated, causing that massive explosion that tore the ship apart. But the real question for us is who was behind it.
Right, and I think that we've made that point pretty clear when you start looking at the sugar and the motive and you follow the money. It's always funny to me how when you follow the money, you can really get to the bottom of motive. So let's move on to World War I then and the sinking of the Lusitania, which I'm sure a lot of people know about, but a lot of people are very unaware of this as well. So what do you think happened in that situation?
Well, in 1915, England was at war with Germany. We had not yet joined that conflict, but there were interests on both sides of the Atlantic that wanted to see America come into the war. Lusitania was a British passenger ship on its way from New York to England, and it was sunk by a U-boat off the Irish coast with more than 100 American dead. And the American public was told the Germans sank this ship just to kill a lot of innocent women and children, but that was not the case. They sank the ship because it was loaded with munitions. It had millions of rifle cartridges, it had shrapnel shells and gun cotton, and the Germans were trying to prevent those munitions from reaching the battlefields of Europe where they would kill German soldiers, though it's natural enough. Now, the ship was a mighty ship. If you can see footage of it on YouTube, but it went down in just 18 minutes after one torpedo struck it. Now, also, the survivors said there were 2 explosions, a small one and a massive one. And many analysts, there's not agreement about this, but many analysts think that the second huge explosion was the munitions detonating. Beyond this, it should be mentioned that the American public was not told the truth. There was a hearing here on the sinking, which, of course, fanned the flames of war and helped push us into the war. But at the hearing, the original manifest was hidden. It was ordered by Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, to be hidden in the archives of the U.S. Treasury. So the original manifest that listed the munitions was not seen at the hearing. We should also learn something about how this was set up. Winston Churchill was then head of the British Admiralty, and prior to the sinking, he ordered a study to be done, a political study, to determine what the impact would be on America if a British passenger ship was sunk by the Germans with American passengers on board. And Edward Grey, who was the British foreign minister, asked a question of Edward Mandell House, who was the top advisor to President Woodrow Wilson. The question was this, quote, what will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board, unquote? And House replied, quote, I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war, unquote. On top of this, we should mention that the British knew where the U-20, that U-boat, was located. They knew it through British naval intelligence intercepts of German messages, because they'd cracked Germany's naval codes. And Commander Joseph Kenworthy, who was then an officer in British naval intelligence, wrote, quote, the Lusitania was sent at considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and with their escorts withdrawn, unquote. And let me give you one more quote from Patrick Beasley. He's considered the leading authority on the history of British naval intelligence. He was long an officer in that service, and here's what he writes in his book, Room 40, quote, I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Such a conspiracy could not have been put into effect without Winston Churchill's express permission and approval, unquote. Patrick Beasley. And let me ask you an interesting trivia question. When the Maine was sunk, do you know who the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was?
I don't know.
It was Teddy Roosevelt. Well, by November of 1898, Teddy Roosevelt had become, that same year, governor of New York, and by 1901, he was president of the United States, which is a pretty rapid advance. Mm-hmm. Well, who do you suppose the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was when the Lusitania went down? It was his cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who then went on to become governor of New York and then president of the United States.
Think of the coincidence of that happening.
Well, that's what we're trying to point out today, that these things are not coincidences. And I'd just like to mention, by the way...
okay, let's mention it after the break. Okay, hold that thought. You know where you are. We'll be back after this 4-minute break with the Power Hour. Stay tuned. This is Joyce.
And JD.
We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the Power Hour, ladies and gentlemen. It is 24 minutes past the hour. We are speaking today with Mr. James Perloff, author of Truth is a Lonely Warrior. You can check out his website, which is www.bookrefuge@aol.com, and he has another one at www.jamesperloff.com. And we were right in the middle of a discussion about World War I and the sinking of the Lusitania, and I wanted to point out how interesting I think it is that this was just a few years before the CFR came into fruition, isn't it?
Yes, they were established after World War I when the United States Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty, which would have attached us to the League of Nations, the first attempt at world government, and they were created directly in reaction to that in order to make sure America did get into world government.
Just interesting. I think that little detail slips right in there. But let's get on to World War II. A lot of people know, or a lot of people postulate that Pearl Harbor was an inside job, but you got some pretty amazing inside information that says it not only was it an inside job, but again that this common thread of the banker interest is what is ultimately responsible.
Right, and let's draw the connections between World War I and World War II. We know that the Illuminati have a plan for a world government, and we know that the Bible talks about the beast or the Antichrist ruling the world. I'd like to point out to people that to govern the world, you need a world government. That's self-evident, and that gives us insight into what's been happening with these international creations such as the EU and NAFTA and the constant globalization of our world. But in tying together the world wars, the Illuminati use what I like to call a three-headed hydra of globalism, communism, and Zionism. Globalism takes the form of world government. As we just mentioned, World War I produced the League of Nations, the first attempt at world government. The World War II produced the UN, which was a stronger form of world government. And if we had a World War III, you can be sure they would want a complete world government for the planet. In terms of communism, you'll notice that the very first communist state, the Soviet Union, was created out of World War I. World War II was used to spread communism over half the globe into Eastern Europe and to the Asian continent. And if we had a World War III, we would have a communist-style government. It might not be termed Marxist in name, but it would be Marxist or totalitarian in principle in the way it operated. And as far as Zionism goes, of course, in World War I, you had the Balfour Declaration, by which England promised the Zionist Federation that they would create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, even though England didn't control Palestine yet. And in World War II, in the wake of that, we had the creation of the State of Israel. World War III would create the throne of the Antichrist in Israel, which, so far as I'm concerned, is the purpose of the Zionist movement. That's why these banksters are behind it, why the Illuminati have been behind it, and I don't regard this modern State of Israel as something godly or the recreation of biblical Israel, as many Christians have been led to believe. But let's move up to World War II. and Pearl Harbor. We were talking before about the connections between cousins, between Teddy and Franklin D. Well, come up to World War World War I, Franklin D. Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now he's the President. And Winston Churchill, who had been head of the British Admiralty when the Lusitania went down, is now the British Prime Minister. Now they're heads of state, which is enough to send chills up your spine. Now they're conspiring together to get us into the Second World War, to bring America into this one. And they're trying to use the same tactic, by the way. They kept trying to provoke the Germans through many means, but a principal one was depth-charging U-boats. And I'm going to give you a quote you might not have heard before. This one's not in my book, but it's from Admiral Dönitz, who was the commander of the German submarine fleet. This quote is from the trial at Nuremberg. He said, quote, "A 300-mile safety zone was granted to America by Germany when international law called for only 3 miles. I suggested minefields at Halifax and around Iceland, but the Fuhrer rejected this because he wanted to avoid conflict with the United States. When American destroyers in the summer of 1941 were ordered to attack German submarines, I was forbidden to fight back. I was thus forced not to even attack British destroyers for fear there might be a mistake," unquote, Admiral Dönitz. And the point being that the Germans learned from their mistake. They were not going to give us another Lusitania. They were not going to sink another American ship because they knew what America's entry into World War I had done to them. It cost them that war. Right. So in frustration, they turned to provoking Japan. And Roosevelt's Interior Secretary Harold Ickes said, quote, "Our best entrance into the war would be by way of Japan," unquote. And a 8-point plan of provocation to Japan was put together for the president by Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum of Naval Intelligence, and it ended with this quote, "If by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better," unquote.
We've got to take a quick break. James, we are talking to James Perloff today about Truth as a Lonely Warrior, and we were talking about the provocation of 8-point plan to get us into a war with Japan. So once we come back, 3-minute break, we will continue this discussion.
Welcome back to Power Hour. Thank you for joining us. Gold is down $7.30 today to $12.96. Anyway, thank you for joining us today, caring about your world and wanting to know the truth about the 6 wars. We're going to get back to the interview with James Perloff and JD here in just a second. Let me remind you that we are supported by you. That's who keeps the Power Hour on the air. And I don't care if you're a guest, you're a listener, I don't care who you are, please purchase from the Power Hour. That is what supports us. And yesterday we had an amazing discussion with Dr. Raymond Francis on how to stay younger, not be sick again, never fear cancer again. Those books are available at the Power Mall and on special for $13.50, along with his items, which hardly ever go on sale. So take advantage of that. Those are the Beyond Health products. Topperson, Charcoal, and Ioderol are on special, along with the Soil Cube, Transcendental Physics, and, of course, Truth is a Lonely Warrior is on special for $17.75. Let me add that this discussion about 6 world wars that I knew very little about is only a very small part of what you can read in the book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, because these 6 wars are included in one chapter. That's only one chapter. There's 23 chapters that will absolutely keep you riveted to find out how all these things happen. The devil is banker, how the cartel has run America, Vietnam, on and on and on. Satan's control structure, Freemasonry, Zionism, purposes of the Iraq War. And I would encourage you, if you want to know more about these 6 wars, definitely get the book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. And you can get so much more information on these 6 wars than we can possibly cover here in just this 1 hour. So give us a call at 573-378-6049, 573-378-6049, and order from the Power Mall.
Yep, and I want to return back to our conversation with Mr. Perloff. Again, the website for all of his books is www.jamesperloff.com. I encourage everyone to go check that website out. And again, just to piggyback on something that Joyce just said, there's so much depth in this book. Everything from population control and vaccines and weather control and the green movement, and all of these things do have the same common thread. And we were just speaking about U.S. getting involved with World War II and an 8-point provocation plan that had come up with Japan and us. So can we continue that discussion, Mr. Perloff?
Absolutely. And I'd like to say something about the decision to base the fleet at Pearl Harbor. People may want to know, what was our fleet doing there in the first place? You know, when Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the fleet move from the West Coast to Pearl Harbor, the American fleet commander, Admiral J.L. Richardson, flew into a rage. And speaking of flying, he flew to Washington to talk to the president about this decision. He told him the reasons we should not put the fleet in Pearl Harbor. Our ships were going to be boxed in like sardines, which you can tell if you look at a map of Pearl Harbor at that time. Pearl Harbor was approachable by attackers from 360 degrees of uninhabited waters, where if they would be safe on the West Coast, you'd have to pass all kinds of commercial shipping to get there. Also, you'd have to supply our fleet in Pearl Harbor across 2,000 ocean miles. Pearl Harbor did not have very good oil storage, so you couldn't keep the fleet on a war footing there anyway. 37% of the Hawaiian population was ethnically Japanese, meaning you can have a lot of espionage and potential for sabotage. Being that far from America would bring low morale to the troops. He gave Roosevelt all these reasons why we should not base the fleet in Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt then told Richardson, he gave him one reason. He said, it'll deter Japanese aggression. Well, guess what? As of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew that putting the fleet at Pearl Harbor did not deter Japanese aggression. But guess who got the blame? It was the Navy. The president came out in the media smelling like roses. Well, I'd like to talk about how we provoked that attack, but for lack of time, I'd like to instead focus on Washington's foreknowledge of this attack. They absolutely knew it was coming. And they knew through several means. We had cracked Japan's diplomatic code. It was called the Purple Code. This is a code that Japan used to communicate to all of its embassies around the world. Had to be enciphered and deciphered by machine. We developed our own machines. We cracked that code in 1940. So when relations were tense in 1941, the President of the United States was reading Japan's diplomatic messages on a same-day basis, him and his several top cabinet members. And so we knew that they had ordered their spies in Hawaii to report to Tokyo the exact locations of our ships in dock. We knew that they told the Germans that war was about to break out. We even had translated their declaration of war before they submitted it. But none of this was transmitted to the commanders in Hawaii. On top of the cracking of the diplomatic code, FDR received many personal warnings about the attack. He got one from Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, who told him in 1941 that if relations worsened, Japan planned to attack Pearl Harbor with all its strength. Elliot Thorpe was the U.S., he was a brigadier general, the U.S. military observer in Java, which was then under the control of the Dutch. The Dutch received a warning about Pearl Harbor, which they conveyed to Thorpe. He was so alarmed, he sent a total of 4 warnings to Washington about Pearl Harbor and was finally told, send no more warnings. And you can see him interviewed on YouTube in the documentary produced by BBC. It's called Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. J. Edgar Hoover warned the president about the attack based on information received from Dusko Popov, a Yugoslavian spy. And Popov is also interviewed in that documentary you can watch on YouTube. Martin Dies, U.S. Congressman, received information about the attack. He shared it with the president, who told him not to pass it on. If you go to my website and click on my articles on Pearl Harbor, I have his quote. Senator Guy Gillette, the same. Colonel F.G.L. Weidman, the Dutch military attaché in Washington, warned General Marshall, our chief of staff, of the attack. But none of this was passed on to the military men, the fleet commander and the army commander at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kemmler and General Short. And finally, you guys, I know you've had Robert Stinnett on, and of course he's the guy who proved through the Freedom of Information Act in his book, A Day of Deceit, who he also cracked Japan's naval codes. This was not known for a long time, but the naval codes also, of course, revealed the attack because the Japanese did not observe complete silence as they approached Pearl Harbor, and the most important message that we translated was this one from Admiral Yamamoto to the Japanese First Air Fleet, quote, the task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order, unquote. And the transcript of the message from Admiral Yamamoto.
Well, I think it's really easy to see that there's obviously, it was a planned event. We knew it was going to happen, but it seems to me that there's always money as the motive. So what is the monetary motive for getting this established and getting us into this war?
Well, I think that the motives certainly there's always monetary benefits. If you look even at World War I, when Woodrow Wilson appointed Bernard Baruch head of the War Industry Board, Baruch and his banker buddies made billions on war material that was not even delivered to the front, and in many cases never even manufactured, and that was uncovered by something called the Graham Committee of Congress. But the findings, most of the public didn't find out because the same bankers owned the newspapers that were controlling the flow of information. So there was profit in this war, but I think the main reasons were really more satanic, having to do with the creation of the UN, the expansion of communism, and the creation of the State of Israel.
Wow. Well, let's skip forward into history to the 1950s then, and we'll talk about the Korean War, because I want to see how this thread is just continuing along up into present day. So let's...
Right. Well, the first thing to know about Korea is that this is an artificially created war, and a good question to ask people is, do you know how the communists came into control of North Korea? Because the war began in 1950 when Kim Il-sung, dictator of North Korea, invaded the non-communist South. But how did Kim Il-sung come to power in the first place? And, the answer is that the usual process, our American foreign policy put him there. And here's how it happened. During World War II, we were fighting a two-front war against the Japanese in the Pacific and against the Germans on the continent of Europe. Stalin, our quote-unquote ally during this war, was fighting a one-front war against Germany. But at the big three conferences at Tehran and Yalta, President Roosevelt asked Stalin if he'd break his peace pact, which he was maintaining with Japan, and enter the Pacific War. And Stalin said, sure, I'll do that on condition that America supply my Far Eastern Army with all the tanks and jeeps and weapons and material it will need for this expedition. So Roosevelt agreed, and 600 shiploads of Lend-Lease were sent to Stalin for the express purpose of fighting Japan. But Stalin is very clever. When does he enter the Pacific War? He waits until it's virtually over. He sends his troops in. We've already pounded Hiroshima with the atomic bomb. Japan is begging for surrender. There's no need to have Stalin come into this conflict, but now his troops pour into China. Well, after 5 days, they start collecting all these surrendered Japanese weapons, and then they turn those weapons plus their American Lend-Lease over to Mao Zedong for the overthrow of the Chinese nationalist government. But as far as Korea goes, Korea until now had been a protectorate of Japan, so what are you going to do with it when the war is over? Well, in 1944, Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, proposed that after the war, Korea could be divided into an international trusteeship, including the Russians. You know how Germany was divided into East and West, where the Russians controlled the East. Well, North Korea was divided into North and South, with Stalin being given the North. Now, this is an enormous trophy to give Stalin, because he did nothing to win the Pacific War, but we gave it to him nonetheless. It was our proposal. And then Stalin equipped Kim Il-sung with a 150,000-man army, 10 divisions with hundreds of tanks, hundreds of fighters and bombers, heavy artillery. When we departed South Korea, we didn't live in with one tank, not even one anti-tank gun. So war was inevitable. Kim Il-sung was just waiting for Mao Zedong to consolidate control of the Communist China and his rear. He wanted to secure his rear, and so war was inevitable in 1950. But why did the Illuminati want the Korean War? And the answer is in world government. You go back to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, 511, it says our goal is to, quote, gradually absorb all the state forces of the world and to form a super government, unquote. Well, that became reality with the UN, which was created by CFR members. The 47 CFR members were at the founding conference of the UN in San Francisco in 1945. And, of course, David Rockefeller, who was long its chairman, it was his older brother, John D., who donated the money to create the UN, $8.5 million for the land. Well, once the UN was established, the next goal was to empower it. They wanted to empower the UN, and what did it say in the UN Charter? The first step is to maintain international peace and security. So they wanted to prove to the world that the UN could maintain peace and security. 2 years into the war, the CFR's Journal Foreign Affairs published a lead article called Korea in Perspective, and here's what the article said in conclusion, quote, the burden of my argument based on Korea is that we've made historic progress toward the establishment of a viable system of collective security, unquote. It's all about world government. U.S. soldiers, by the way, it's hypocrisy to say that it was a UN action. 90% of the soldiers were U.S. There were 15 other countries, but they sent token forces. The Greeks sent 1,500 men. It was U.S. soldiers dying out there, but they characterized it as a UN war, and Americans had to fight under the UN flag, and you can be sure that brought a lot of smirks to the faces of the honchos at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Well, I think it's interesting, too, that we're seeing a shift away from monetary motive to more specific, just a world government motive.
Control motive, yeah.
Well, if I spent more time on the Spanish-American War, I would have shown you the broader political motives for that. It wasn't just about money. It was about destroying Spain as a world power. It was about creating a British-American alliance because Britain was the only country that supported America during the Spanish-American War, and they started something called the Anglo-American League, which became the Pilgrim Society during the Spanish-American War, and that became the parent organization to the Council on Foreign Relations. So we just didn't have time to get into the non-financial. There's a spectrum of motives to each of these wars. One more I think I should mention for the Korean War. They're very interested in taking away from Congress the right to declare war. You go back to the Protocols of Zion again. It says in the 10th section, quote, "In the near future we shall establish the responsibility of presidents. We shall invest the president with a right of declaring a state of war," unquote. Now move ahead to 1944 when the UN's being prepared. The Council on Foreign Relations says in a memorandum, quote, "A difficulty was cited, that arising from the constitutional provision that only Congress may declare war. This argument was countered with the contention that a treaty would override this barrier and that such a police action as might be recommended by the International Security Organization need not be construed as war," unquote. Now get this, guys. Since we passed the UN, there's never been a declaration of war. When Harry Truman sent troops to Korea, he not only asked for a declaration of war, he not only not asked for one, he didn't even consult Congress. And here's the statement he made to the press, quote, "We are not at war. This is a police action." A police action, well, I'm sure there was small comfort to the families of the tens of thousands of GIs who died there to know this is not a war. But they took away the right to declare war. And members of Congress did not stand up against this, by the way, very hard, because they'd already condemned the Truman administration because its State Department had pushed China into the hands of communism. And now, ostensibly, Truman was sending our troops to fight communism. And so they backed off because they did not want to see Korea fall to communism. That was the trump card that the Illuminati were playing. But understand, they had no intention of defeating communism. As you know, when General MacArthur pressed for victory, he was rapidly dismissed. This was not about defeating communism or winning. It was simply about validating the UN as a peacekeeper. And, of course, the original boundaries were set at the end of the war where they had been at the 38th parallel.
Right, so we create a bad guy so that we can assume the role of the good guy. And I realize that there are a lot of facets to this, both monetary and the drive towards global governance. But I want to see how that drive is pulling us through the incidents at Vietnam and then into the Iraq War. And I know we're going to run out of time and we'll have to touch on these fairly quickly. But if we can just talk to us about how that influence is still continuing on today, I think that would be very important.
Should we talk about Vietnam first or move to today?
I'd like to talk about Vietnam quickly because Vietnam and Iraq are both probably the ones that affect most of our listeners still today. So I really want to get as much as we can in before we run to the break.
Right. Well, of course, we got into Vietnam officially through the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. And I think no one today would dispute that there was no attack in Tonkin Gulf. In my book, I quote Admiral James Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was a pilot called to the scene of the alleged Tonkin Gulf incident of August 4th, 1964. He reported there were no Vietnamese torpedo boats whatsoever. And let me just quote the end of his quote in his book, In Love and War. When he found the next day we were ordered to counterattack the coast of Vietnam, he said, quote, "I felt like I'd been doused with ice water. We were about to launch a war under false pretenses. It was a bad portent that we were under the control of a mindless Washington bureaucracy, vain enough to pick their own legitimacies regardless of the evidence," unquote, Congressional Medal of Honor winner James Stockdale. As you guys know, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was written before the Tonkin Gulf incident even took place. It was written by William P. Bundy, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, head of the Alger Hiss Defense Fund, member of the Committee of 300, member of Skull and Bones, and when he left the State Department, David Rockefeller appointed him the editor of Foreign Affairs Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. How's that for an insider? But to move on to Iraq, of course, we were told the false flag in this sense, and we're not going to talk about 9/11 here; it's too complicated. But we were told that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. You recall that Colin Powell went before the UN and said that the statement I today has been backed up by sources, solid sources. We were giving you facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. President Bush said in his radio address, 2003, March 8th, he said, quote, Saddam Hussein and his weapons are a threat to this country. I will not leave the American people at the mercy of the Iraqi.
Hey, we got to go to this break. I am sorry, we got to go to this break. 3 minutes. We'll be back. You got to get this book. Get the CD from today's program. Get it on. Welcome back to Power Hour. Thank you for joining us. I do want to encourage you to get the CD from today's program. In fact, both hours with Dr. Elena George and with James Perloff, because so much information. We asked him to cover 6 wars in like 38 minutes, without commercials. Almost impossible, but what a good job, though. I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, so we were just talking about how many false pretenses have led us into these wars, and I want to get back onto the subject of Iraq war and talk about how the monetary motive and the world government motive has played into that, and let's see if we can make some predictions about what's going to happen in the future.
Right. Well, just to wrap up what I was saying before, we were given as the justification for the Iraq War that it was all about weapons of mass destruction. But anyone who goes on YouTube today, just look for Scott Ritter, R-I-T-T-E-R, who was the chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq, affirming that there were no weapons of mass destruction there. And the point we've been trying to make today is that there's a pattern to events. And I just want to give you a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said, quote, single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers too plainly prove a deliberate, systematic plan of reducing us to slavery, unquote. And that quote from Jefferson, I think, very much encapsulates what's been happening in the 20th century. It's very clear that we're being controlled by the same predatory oligarchy, controlling things from behind the scenes, and the reasons we go to war are not the reasons that we're publicly given.
Mm-hmm. Well, and really quickly, we've only got a few minutes left before the end of the show. I can't thank you enough for coming on the air today. I'd love to have you back on again. Ladies and gentlemen, the book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, as I mentioned during the other break, there's just so much depth to this, and we obviously are asking a lot of him to cover this so quickly. But what is the most important thing that people can take away from this book and what we're learning about the future of this one world government?
Yeah, what was your objective in writing this? What do you want people to know as a result of this?
I just want people to know the truth and to awaken from the slumber of the lies that have been created by the corporate media. There's so many lies, and you know that this cuts, Joyce, you know this, that it cuts across so many sectors. I'm a registered nurse like you, and I was stunned when I started learning about vaccines that have even penetrated the medical profession. There's so many things people need to know to live a life in accordance with God's will, and Satan has, through his control mechanisms here on earth, has generated so many lies that the public has been indoctrinated through repetition in the mechanism of the big lie. My goal is to bring people the truth, and that's why I call this book Truth is a Lonely Warrior. If you go back in history, you'll find that at every stage of history, whether it was World War I or Spanish-American War, there were always people trying to tell the truth. Those were the lonely warriors. They wrote books. They were published by small presses. You go looking, you'll find them. And I tried to summarize and encapsulate that information in a documented, concise, but complete book for people to read and to give to their friends who don't believe any of these things we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
You're certainly quite the historian, sir. We thank you very much for joining us. I don't know if I've ever known a nurse that knows that much history. You're incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for joining us. We can do anything. That's right. Thank you so much, James, for joining us. And we'll people will be intrigued, I know, by this book, want to get it, and then we will talk in terms of more of the history of the lies, unmasking the forces behind global destruction. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much, and thanks to the listeners for bearing with me and hearing this information.
Awesome. Thank you so much.